how do we measure expertise? How do we fact check? How do we determine what are our trusted sources? So how does that play into your book and what we're going to be hearing in future chapters?
I think that's the hardest. I mean, and I think at some level, we've always done this badly. So like when I was in high school, I was told to look at the publisher and the city the publisher was from, and somehow that was relevant. But nobody ever explained to me why or how I was supposed to decide whether or not it was a publisher who I should trust. Like, how would I know that anyway? I can understand its validity to people who are already experts, and ChatGPT is a perfect example. ChatGPT is great if you're already an expert in the topic you're searching. Man, it pulls stuff together fast, and you're like, you go through it and you're like, nope, this is good, that's fine, nope, and you can go through it and you can pull it out and you've got a document ready and you're good to go. Right? It's great in that sense. It's just filling in the typing and putting it together in a structure that's tidy, and then you can kind of edit and you go along. I think the internet's the same, right? So if you're already an expert, then you're not going to get tricked by all of these things that take you outside of that context. Most of us, all of us, are not expert at something. Most of us are not expert at anything. And so that puts you in a really bad position. If your only tool is using expert tools to evaluate everything and you ain't got them, then it's a free-for-all, right? So there's really great methods out there for fact checking. Certainly the SIFT method that Michael Caulfield pulled together is the one that people point to the most. And that's fine if the thing you're looking for has a right answer. But if it's how do I impact poverty in my home city, which are real life questions that I would love for us to be more worried about in our schools. I mean, we do projects. Certainly my kids have come home with projects they've done and stuff like that. But they're projects that have right answers inside the school that get graded for getting the right way, even though we know those don't work inside of our cities.
Yeah, and I think the third part of what I was mentioning or asking about was the expertise and fact checking, but the trusted sources piece.
Yeah.
We went through that with COVID. Like where
Right?
are we getting our information? We used to get our parents' generation listen to like Walter Cronkite. I mean, now we're listening to Joe Rogan or a countless number of other podcasters. Like who do we? Who do we get our information from and who do we trust? Yeah.
Yeah, and this foreshadows for later, but the whole idea of research, like I did my research, is just, it's every time I hear it now, it gets terrifying. I always sit with my students, I always force them to go, did you search or did you research? Like, let's just calm down a little bit here. Research is something you can do if you have expertise. Searching is what you're doing without it. And there are definitely ways of searching better or worse, and there are sources that I trust, but they're based on my values, right? So I think mostly the New York Times does a reasonable job. There's a whole swath of people in your country who do not believe that. Right? And for them, that newspaper doesn't reflect their values.
Part
And
of
it's
that
not
is the
about truth, it's
abundance
about
of
values.
sources too. In the mid 20th century, you have 3 news sources. So as long as they're all on the same page, that is truth because that's the only source you have. I think now with this many voices, it's like having 2 watches. You're never really sure what time it is. And the more voices we have, the more opportunities there are for people to attack any single one of those because they disagree with it.
And there's more people to be in the vacuum of people who believe the thing that you're believing.
Yeah.
Right. So I always think of flat earthers, who are amongst the most mysterious of groups to me, because I can't imagine how you can live on a round planet and think it's flat. But they do. And there's enough of them to all convince each other that they do. And there's enough of that sort of group thing to pull together. And there are enough people out there who will say, don't trust authority. And of course, sometimes you should not trust authority. It's a complex situation, but
well, I guess too, that's that abundance of connection because they can find each other in ways that they couldn't 20 years ago.
For sure.
I'm terrified of the current misinformation landscape, but part of me is a little bit optimistic, like answering how do I deal with poverty in my town?
He's so optimistic.
I feel like there's the potential for the tools to analyze. Like, this is how a million different communities have dealt with it. And these are the outcomes. And here is some neutral analysis that is based on data. Now, how you choose to accept that data is, going to be related to values and what you want to hear. But like the potential to get not the answer, but useful, neutral information exists or will exist, won't it?
I would argue that it won't. I mean, I can't tell you that it won't, but certainly that's the dream of the meta study, right? So if I take 800 studies, so John Hattie is famous for writing a book about 800 studies about education, right? It's the classic massive meta study. I've looked at so many versions of education. I can tell you what improves learning the most. The problem is each one of those 800 studies has measured learning slightly differently in a slightly different context, that when you put them together, the ideas don't, it doesn't, they would argue that because I've done lots of them, it levels out, which is true if the thing you're counting is a counting noun. So if you do 800 mega studies on the number of mosquitoes in a community, right? There's an actual number of mosquitoes. You could count, maybe you can't, but there is an actual number, right? There's a real fact that you can find out. And people's ability to study those mosquitoes are going to balance out, and then you're going to get a number that works out. If you don't believe that learning can be counted, which I don't, then you're not measuring learning, you're measuring the way a test measures people's recall of something that happened in a classroom with a random person in front of it. So you're not actually, and that's the same thing with poverty. The thing you're going to have to measure is going to be what? The number of people who go to
actions given certain variables and resulting outcomes.
But the messiness is on all the things that you didn't tell me. So at some level, are you counting the number of people who go to a community food place? Because if you are, that might be indicative of the community food places working well, or it might be indicative of the fact that there's more poverty in that city. So the measurement you take doesn't give you that information. It's a number you can count, but it doesn't have the context to it. Right? That's the problem with a meta study. Is at some level, if the thing you're meta studying is recovery rates for people to be able to go back to running after they have a meniscus tear, at some level, there's a real number in the world that tells us whether or not someone ran again after a meniscus tear, which is why we do a lot of meta studies in the sciences and in medicine. But when you talk about poverty, it's not, I can't have 7 poverties. I can have number of people below the poverty line, right? And I can measure whether or not they're getting a certain amount of money. You can kind of do that, but then you're measuring money. You're not measuring, you know what I mean? Like it's always,
yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but I feel like there's still, even in qualitative matters, useful information that can be gained. Not a definitive decision, but on a smaller level,
sure.
It's okay, neighboring community A did this and neighboring community B did that, and A worked better. Okay, that's my meta study.
So but worked better, that ends up being hard to know.
Yeah. Okay. And just to like step back, just a tip.
Where's your common sense, young man?
No.
You know it when you see it.
So in my dissertation, one of the things I looked at the measures of the community of inquiry. So it's perceptions of students, looking at their cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence against a learning outcome. So when you look at, as Dave's saying, at the vast number of people who've looked at the community of inquiry, they look at learning in terms of learner perception. And some of the measures almost look like satisfaction. Some of them are tests, some of them are GPA, some of them are completion, some are persistence, but they're still calling it in some way, shape, or form learning. And so when we did ours, we had definitions for perceived learning, and we had definitions for more of an objective measure, meaning something that the teacher gave. There was no correlation between the learner's perception of whether they learned and an objective measure of the teacher. There just was none. However, there was almost a perfect correlation between satisfaction and perceived learning. So here, all these studies are out there studying perceived learning. They're studying satisfaction. And it had nothing to do with whether we had 3 measures of objective measures of learning. And one of them was the teacher saying, basically from your gut, do you feel this person can walk out in the world and do what you taught them to do in this class? Like, will they be able to do what the objective measures that you were attempting to teach them in this class? And again, like there was no correlation.
Did you control that number for gender?
Oh, we probably did. Yeah, it's
Because
probably
I'd be
in there
really
somewhere,
curious to know
yeah.
how much that differs by gender, whether or not the dudes in the class were like, yeah, I taught them great and they'll be fine. And whether or not there's a
Yeah, but to kind of, I hopefully that kind of ties into what you're saying, and Jeff, to kind of answer your question, like what everybody in all these prior studies that we kind of had in our lit review, they all said that they were examining learning, but then when you really kind of drill down to it, their measure of learning was all over the place.
Has the age of abundance made this more difficult to solve poverty? Like, I don't feel like we had great answers before, and now because of the abundance, it's harder. I feel like if anything, we've got at least more data, even if it's not totally reliable and it's wonky in some ways.
There's two answers to that. First, like Riddle and Weber from the 70s would tell you that that's asking the wrong question, that you can't solve for something like poverty because it's a wicked
Well,
problem.
he's not on
You
the
can
show,
only-
and it's our show, and we
you
get
can
to ask whatever
only
question
deal
we
with
want.
you can only deal with a small part of any one of these problems, and asking the big question is always the thing that gets you into trouble. Because you can't solve it because we can't even agree on what it is. I think that the extra data helps in some cases, and in other cases, it just like when I look at education specifically, it's a nightmare because every single person who wants to make an argument can pull out a paper to support that argument. They can pull out 20 papers. They can pull out 100 papers to support whatever random position they might have. Like I play this game with my students all the time, right? Where I'll come up and I'll give them one side of an argument and say, oh, go look for this. And then I'll give them the other side and they're like, we just read all this unbiased, objective literature that said that this was true. And then we go and they're like, well, this all says that it's false. How can, like, what's the right answer? And the answer, of course, is that I don't know if there's a right
Welcome to
answer.
Dave's class.
Welcome to Dave's class. I don't know. You just still have to decide what you're
Drop,
going to do in your
drop
class.
flips are over there.
Yeah. But that's the problem with abundance, right? Is like anything, it's the Joe Rogan thing, right? Like if you're looking for a reason to have someone not mask, you can find one study somewhere that proves one thing. And then a bunch of people will know that they're going to get attention by following up that study with another one. So somebody else is going to make one. And suddenly you have 20 studies that all were based on what happened in like the flaws in I'm making this part up now, but the flaws in one manufacturer's mask technique that's been extrapolated to all masks, or takes the idea of masking out of context, or claims that if someone wears a mask, somebody else can still get sick, which is of course true. It's that it reduces it statistically and it has a statistical impact on the population is the point, but that's a subtle point. It's boring. But with abundance, you can find somebody to contradict that. I'm sure we could pull up a paper that totally contradicts what I just said. That's the problem. And everybody can find it. And so if you're only looking for the things that support your existing position, you can find that. Whatever that.
Well, I'm going to
position
keep hope alive and see if it lasts until chapters.
That's why we love you.
is. So good.
Oh.